My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today on the podcast, I'm going to be hosting a special guest. His name is Fox Butterfield. He is the man who, in 1979, opened up the New York Times' first Beijing Bureau in the period after the communists took over. From 1949 to 1979, the New York Times did not have a bureau in China. Fox Butterfield is the one who actually opened it up. So I did an interview with him. We're going to have that interview on this podcast. And because of the format of the interview, it'll be a slightly different formatted podcast. Before I get started with everything and talking with this fascinating figure, Mr. Butterfield, I just want to do a quick plug for my book, China's Backstory, The History That Beijing Does Not Want You to Read. We're planning on having it come out September 30th. That date may change. My editors are still kindly beavering their way through the book, trying to make the book stronger. If y'all are interested in keeping up with the progress through the publication process of this book, go to my website, leeharrismore.com. Click on the link up at the top, China's Backstory, and that should take you to the page where you can, quote-unquote, pre-order the book, which is just to say you're signing up for emails to be sent your way as my book comes out. And if you're interested in getting an advanced reader copy of the book, send me an email, ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. My editors have asked me to find smart folks who are willing to read an early, mostly edited copy of the book. And once they read it, post it about it on social media, X, TikToks, Book Talk, wherever you post stuff about books, in an effort to, of course, gin up some buzz before publication. If you're interested, send me an email, ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. Okay, now that I've gotten the necessary self-promotion out of the way, let's talk about who this podcast is really about. Fox Butterfield. For the podcast, I'm planning on doing some interviews, not focused on literature per se, but on talking with experts who had unique and incredible platforms on which to observe Chinese culture, China's politics, and how those things changed. The first of these interviews that I conducted is with Fox Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield was the first New York Times correspondent allowed into Beijing after the revolution. Mr. Butterfield got to China in 1979. He reopened the New York Times Bureau in Beijing, which had been closed since 1949. And then he wrote a book about his experience. The book is called China Alive in the Bitter Sea, derived from a Chengyu. Shengyu Ku Hai. The book is a fantastic, on-the-ground sort of look at China in a period where it's pivoting from Maoism to Dengism. Now, as y'all can probably guess by the fact that there is a Chengyu in this book title, Fox Butterfield is not just any journalist. He's not just some journalist parachuting in to China to report on it. No, he has a deep, deep knowledge of China. When we were setting up the meeting for this interview, he told me he still actually dreams in Chinese sometimes. Fox Butterfield started studying Chinese in 1958. He was inspired by a speech he heard from John Fairbank. That is the John Fairbank, the Dean of China Studies in America, the man who the Fairbank Center at Harvard is named after. Butterfield heard the speech by Fairbank and was intrigued by China, a place that he hadn't really engaged with before, to go and spend the rest of his academic career studying China, something he'll talk about on the podcast. Of course, at the time, China was closed off to Americans, pretty much all Americans, not completely, but all but a handful of Americans. There were almost no journalists in China during the 1960s. Most of the Americans or Westerners in China during the 1960s were communists there who had wound up in China for a variety of reasons. Mr. Butterfield was working in Taiwan studying Chinese history at the time. He entered journalism. He largely leaves behind his graduate studies in the China studies field. He lets that expertise that he has developed lie fallow for a bit. That's not to say that he was unproductive during this period. He goes on to be a journalist. First, he's brought on as a copy boy at the New York Times, and then he's elevated to a reporter. And as a still fairly young reporter, Mr. Butterfield was brought into a New York hotel room filled with file cabinet upon file cabinet of documents that had been collected by Daniel Ellsberg, those documents and the reporting that Mr. Butterfield and others in that group did eventually became known as the Pentagon Papers, and they changed history. Mr. Butterfield received a Pulitzer for his work on the Pentagon Papers. Our understanding of Vietnam was completely revolutionized by the things that Mr. Butterfield and other reporters like Neil Sheehan did. And of course, the impact was felt beyond just the Pentagon Papers. When the Pentagon Papers came out, the administration of President Richard Nixon tried to sue the New York Times. The Supreme Court case that resulted in that has been an affirmation of the protections of the press and their ability to report on scoops, even if the government in the United States does not like it. He was sent to Hong Kong, and that's where all China watchers were at the time. He was there reporting on China. But of course, as y'all know, if you listen to the Chinese Literature Podcast enough, several earthquakes occurred in China around that time, some literal, some metaphorical. At 3:42 a.m. on July 28, 1976, Tangshan, city in Hebei, was rocked by an earthquake, 7.6 on the Richter scale. Probably 300,000 people died. In Chinese tradition, natural disasters usually presage political disasters. In January, Zhou Enlai had already died. On September 9th of 1976, just a few months after the Tangshan earthquake, Mao Zedong, the man who remade China several times, died. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. would come to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing, abandoning Taipei and moving its embassy to Beijing. Shortly thereafter, the U.S. established diplomatic relations with Beijing, abandoning Taipei. And who was it who was the first New York Times correspondent to go to China to report on China? It's none other than Fox Butterfield. Before Mr. Butterfield arrived, there had been no American correspondents in mainland China. There had been a handful of reporters who had passed through, a lot of them connected somehow with the Communist Party, but there had not been any regular American reporters at mainstream newspaper outlets before Mr. Butterfield and his colleagues from the AP and the Washington Post arrived. Of course, having done graduate work in Chinese history, Mr. Butterfield was the perfect reporter to work in China as the New York Times is opening up its Beijing Bureau. Fox Butterfield reported on China for that period from 1979 to 1981. Okay, I've talked on a bunch about Mr. Butterfield. Now let me explain a little bit about how this interview was carried out, because it's a little different from normal podcasts that I've done. Mr. Butterfield lives in Portland, just a 2-hour drive away from where I live here in rainy Eugene, Oregon. For about the past year, he and I had been talking about doing an interview. I contacted him first in the summer of 2024, but I was actually still working on China's backstory. The book got turned in a few months ago, and in March, Fox and I reconnected, and we spoke more seriously about doing an interview. This Memorial Day weekend in 2025, I just happened to be up in Portland with my family. Mr. Butterfield was able to make some time for me. I went to his house. He has this beautiful place up with a fantastic view of much of the city of Portland. We weren't recording in my podcasting studio where I have my fancy $60 microphone equipment. I just use my phone as a microphone. It's my first time doing that. Okay, that's enough of me talking. I'm going to give over the rest of this podcast to letting Fox Butterfield speak. This podcast, because it's such a fascinating interview, occasionally I'm going to step in and guide the listener and explain the topics we're discussing, particularly during transitions. The first thing that we discussed when I first got to his house is how Mr. Butterfield got into China studies. He talks about how John Fairbank made this speech that I alluded to earlier. In 1958, it lured Mr. Butterfield into the China field.
Went to hear John Fairbank?
Yes. So 1958.
September 1958. at the beginning of my sophomore year at Harvard. The United States had been in the Korean War, and China was behind the Korean War, so we'd been fighting a war more or less with China. But in 1958, there was a fear that the United States was going to go to have another war with China over the two little islands called Quemoy and Matsu, Jinmen and Matsu, which were really sitting in the mouths of mainland harbors in Fujian province. At very low tide, you could walk across. And the shelling was going back and forth from those two little islands into mainland towns and villages and vice versa. And it looked like that either the nationalist forces on those islands were going to attack China, or China was going to attack them and the United States, because we had a mutual security treaty with the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, that we would end up in a big war with China. Harvard's China expert at the time was John Fairbank, who was professor of history and had just started an undergraduate course on China. He gave a public lecture that early in September as we were about to choose courses. And I went to hear it, and he said to us that we should know something about China, that was the oldest country in the world, with the oldest history, and it had the most people. It would be ridiculous for us to go to war with this big country over these two specks of land we had no interest in. And I realized, listening to him, that here was this enormous country with an old history, and I knew nothing about it. So I began to audit his class on Chinese history, and I was really the only undergraduate in the class. And at the end of the year, when I did my exam, in those days at Harvard, to find out what grade you got, you put in a self-addressed stamped postcard with your exam booklet, and the professor would send it back to you with your grade. And I got the postcard back, and it was from John Fairbank, the professor. He didn't tell me my grade. He just said, "Please come to see me in my office next Tuesday," or whatever day it was, in Widener Library. So I thought for sure that I had failed the exam and I was in trouble. So I went to see him, and instead what he said to me was, "Fox, you wrote a wonderful exam. Have you ever thought about majoring in Chinese history?" No, I had not thought about it. But he had a wonderful way of encouraging interest in the field of Chinese history. So I decided I would take another class with him, which I did. And pretty soon after that, he said, "Fox, you should start studying Chinese." But he said, "The problem is that right now Harvard's not teaching spoken Chinese, so you have to go to Yale to study spoken Chinese." And Yale was only teaching spoken Chinese because they had a contract with the Air Force, and they were teaching young Air Force recruits, 18-year-old, 19-year-old kids, all boys at the time, to monitor Chinese Communist Air Force traffic.
Was Yale the only place in America that taught Chinese?
Well, there were probably a couple of other places, but when I finally finished up at Harvard and I was thinking of graduate school, Berkeley was another place that might have been teaching spoken Chinese, but they just didn't have the Chinese language facilities. People were not taking it. Yale had, with this contract they had with the Air Force or the U.S. government, they had developed some very, very good textbook system, which still was not, a book was not published, but we had mimeographed pages that we could use. And they also had a rudimentary language laboratory, which was the big old-fashioned tapes that were about this big. And you couldn't take those things home. You went into their language lab and to listen to one of their enormous recording devices. So it was very rudimentary, but it was a way to actually listen to the language.
In your book, you mentioned when you went into the Harvard Library to ask for some tapes, the librarian was like, "Chinese.
Right.
That's a dead language."
Well, when I came back after the summer school at Yale, I came back to Harvard in the fall, and I went into Harvard then had what they called a language laboratory, which had recording devices and these old-fashioned reel-to-reel tapes. And I asked them if they had Chinese, and the woman sitting behind the counter, she peered at me over her glasses. She said, "Young man," she said, "Chinese is a dead language." True story.
Oh, that's so fantastic. From that fascinating discussion, we also discussed Mr. Butterfield's first trip to mainland China. By this point, and we're skipping around in time, so we'll go back and forth. That's part of why I'm butting in here to guide you. So by this point, Mr. Butterfield had lived in Taiwan. He had started but not finished a PhD in Chinese history under John Fairbank. He'd become a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. And then in 1979, he was sent by the New York Times to China for the first time in 3 decades. The New York Times is going to have a journalist there in Beijing. He went initially with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to China. He roomed with a man who you may have heard of. His name is John McCain. Fox Butterfield also, while he was there in Beijing, ran with another man who you may have heard of. This was a young man on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. His name is Joe Biden, and Mr. Butterfield had some interesting things to say about that.
Early 1979, the U.S. and China were making efforts to establish relations, and China was about to open up to itself as well as to the rest of the world. The first thing they did was they invited the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to send some of its members to come to China, and they allowed 2 journalists to come in with them. China had a severe shortage of hotel rooms, so they made everybody room with somebody else. The Chinese assigned me to room with the Navy liaison to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who was a Navy captain whose name was John McCain. And what makes that was particularly interesting was when I first started working for the New York Times and I was a stringer in Taiwan, I managed to get a visa to go to Hanoi during the war in 1969.
Wow, right in the middle.
And in the middle of the war, I was the first New York Times correspondent to get in, and I was just starting. The Vietnamese Communist government allowed me into the prison where they were keeping the American POWs. And John McCain was there. He was in a hospital bed because when he was shot down, he was badly wounded. They couldn't fix him for several years. His father was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, also named John McCain. And his father was a big shot. He was the highest-ranking admiral in the Navy. And they were using McCain as kind of a propaganda tool. But they were regularly torturing him, and he was really badly wounded in the back. So I was able to go into the prison where he was and see him. And I was able to report that he was alive, although very badly wounded. After a number of years later, to have John McCain as my roommate was really something. And we got along really well because I spoke Chinese. And I would say to him, John, let's get away from these guys and let's go see what real Chinese are saying and what people are talking about. So we would ditch our handlers and we'd just walk out in the street and go into restaurants. China was still a very, very closed place. So it was really something. And he really enjoyed this. He was a contrarian person. And it was just great to break away. So we became real buddies. We spent 2 weeks. One of the other members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was a freshman senator from the little state of Delaware, Joe Biden. And McCain and Biden were buddies. So the 3 of us hung out all the time. And the extraordinary thing that I learned about Joe Biden was he was not very bright. So all the discussion now about him was having trouble when he got older and he lost his memory, his ability to think. Actually, that's the way he was, going way back. He was a very, very nice man, but he barely could remember what country we were in. It was rather shocking, but his staff was very good. I always supposed it was because he was from a very small state. Honestly, he was just not very bright even back then. But he was a very, very, very nice man. And being able to speak Chinese made a huge difference.
So were they essentially leaning on your Chinese skills to get them around?
They being
Joe Biden and John McCain.
We had Chinese handlers who were taking it when we had our meals and the meetings. But I would take them out and say, let's just walk down the street and see let's go to. It wasn't easy to get into a restaurant because you had to have special credentials even to do that. You couldn't just walk in a restaurant. But we found that some people were actually happy to talk to us. Anybody we could find on the street to talk to us. It was exciting. And Chinese hadn't been able to talk to anybody for so long. They couldn't even talk to each other. You didn't know who was going to report to and what would happen.
In 1961, Mr. Butterfield got a Fulbright to study in Taiwan. He'd finished up his undergrad at Harvard, and he gets this Fulbright. He is the only student on the Fulbright to Taiwan at the time who's not a graduate student. Everyone else was much older and was finishing their PhD. Surprisingly, Fox Butterfield was also the only one of the 4 Fulbright students who spoke Chinese and who actually bothered to learn the Chinese language. It's hard to wrap your brain around how weird this world was. But a lot of the experts in China studies, those folks who today are retiring from the field of China studies, many of them did not learn to speak Chinese. They might be able to read Chinese, but oftentimes they didn't speak Chinese. No one expected them to learn Chinese. Mr. Butterfield pushed himself to speak the language, but that was counter to what was expected of him. When you first went over the Pacific, you went to Taiwan, right?
Yes, when I graduated, I was very lucky. I got a Fulbright scholarship, fellowship, and they were, in those days, they gave out 4 of those a year to Taiwan. The other people who had them were all graduate students who were finishing the work on their PhDs from different universities, Cornell, Berkeley, Michigan. But here I had just graduated, and I hadn't yet entered graduate school. And I was funded through the American Embassy in Taiwan, and there was a Fulbright section. So I had to report to the embassy to get my money and to go in to see them. And they assumed that I should be finishing my doctoral dissertation because that's what other people were doing. And they kept, "What's wrong with you that you want to?" Because I said I want to take Chinese language lessons, and they thought this was just bizarre.
Why would anyone want to speak Chinese?
No, but there was a very small program that was at that time in Taipei that had 4 Chinese people who were teaching spoken Chinese, and they had 4 American graduate students. The other 3 were all quite a bit older than I was, and they were finishing the work on their doctoral dissertations. I was 21, and they were in their late 20s, early 30s.
Did they speak Chinese?
No. They were there with their wives, and some of them had young families with children.
Uh-huh.
And they were really just finishing the research on their doctoral dissertation. So they were at a whole different stage of their educational experience than I was. And what I really wanted to do was learn Chinese. But there were really no Americans studying Chinese at the time. There were a few American missionaries in Taipei, but they were there to Christianize the Chinese. And that was it.
Where did you study Chinese at?
So there was a small program that was it was called the Cornell School. And I've never totally understood who funded it, but it was theoretically run by Cornell. And the guy who administered it was finishing his doctoral dissertation. He was an American who was married to a Chinese woman, and his spoken Chinese was quite good. And they had 4 Chinese teachers who were probably refugees from the mainland at that time. People had come from in 1949 and fled China to Taiwan. And they were all from northern China, so they spoke good Mandarin.
Because it would have been hard to find good Mandarin speakers.
Well, there were still people who had come from the mainland at that point, and they were younger. So I had 4 different teachers who thought it was kind of funny as a kid, in their view, wanted to speak Chinese. But I just loved it from the beginning. I had no idea why. And I'm lucky to have had this background in the Yale program, which really did emphasize spoken Chinese. They were trying to get people to really be able to speak so they could monitor Chinese Communist Air Force traffic.
Where did you live in Taiwan?
So when I first went there, I explained to my handlers at the U.S. Embassy that I wanted to live with a Chinese family if I could. I forgot exactly how I found it, but I was able to live with a family. There was a family who was from Beijing. They would come as refugees in 1949. So I was there, and I graduated in 1961 from Harvard. So it was 11, 12 years after the people had come to Taiwan from the mainland. They all thought they were going back. I'm pretty sure they would reconquer the mainland.
Just a few more years.
Just a few more. That's a long time ago now. That's 60 years ago. Yeah. So I was able to find a family, and I was able to pay them to do it because it was a commercial exchange for them. I wanted the experience of living with a Chinese family so I could speak Chinese. And they just wanted the money. And they had a couple of older Chinese people who were by themselves, who fled to Taiwan, and they were just by themselves, who were living there. And they had a Japanese guy who was the same age as me, who was enrolled in the Japanese Foreign Service. And he wanted him to learn to speak Chinese. And he ultimately, years later, became Japan's ambassador to the mainland.
What was his name?
Oh, it's so long ago.
Okay.
And we were roommates in this Chinese house
That's cool.
in Taiwan. It was an interesting, mixture of cultures. But he was very good at spoken Chinese. He was, unlike most Japanese, he was very good with languages. Japanese have a lot of trouble with foreign languages, as you may notice. We hung out together a lot, and I went to audit some classes at Taiwan University. And I was able to sit in on several classes, and I was able to meet some young Taiwanese writers and Chinese intellectuals in Taiwan.
Now, this is the Chinese Literature Podcast, and even though this interview is about this fascinating history that Fox Butterfield witnessed, y'all know that if there's a literature angle, I have to explore it. So here it is. Fox Butterfield knew both Chen Ruoxi and Liao, famous Taiwanese writers. In fact, and I didn't know this until I did the interview, Mr. Butterfield revealed that he dated Chen Ruoxi while he was in Taiwan. I haven't done a podcast on either the works of Liao or Chen Ruoxi, but both are pretty important Taiwanese writers, both of whom I really do want to do a podcast on their works. Chen Ruoxi is particularly interesting. She's this Taiwanese author. She goes to an American college or a couple of American colleges. Then, though she's Taiwanese, she marries a man in Taiwan who's from mainland China who had fled the communist. And the two of them, along with their kids, actually moved to China in the mid-1960s. And their family got stuck there during the Cultural Revolution. She wrote some stories about living through the Cultural Revolution that I read in my Taiwanese literature class in Taiwan way back in 2013. The story being Jingjing de Sheng'er. I'll probably do a podcast on that work by Chen Ruoxi at some point. But let's turn back to what Fox Butterfield has to say about that fascinating experience. You knew Liao and...
I knew that's how I met Liao.
And who was the other?
But Chen Ruoxi.
Chen Ruoxi, right.
She was my girlfriend.
Really?
Yes.
You dated? What was it like knowing Chen Ruoxi and Liao?
I mean, it's so long ago. I would be making stuff up. Chen Ruoxi and I were the same age. She just graduated from college. I just graduated from college. And her father was a carpenter. And she lived in a house relatively close to where I lived in Taipei. And my daily bicycle route from the house where I lived to the school I was going to took me right by her house. And I forgot exactly how I met her. Honestly, I just forget, because that was 1961. And we hung out a lot together. And she very much wanted to get to the United States to go to graduate school. And I was able to help her apply. And she got a scholarship at Mount Holyoke. And she came to the U.S. the following year. And when I was at the end of my first year in Taiwan, I went back to graduate school. Now, I wanted to stay in Taiwan, but my professor, John Fairbank, kept sending me letters saying I had to come back and get serious. Stop studying Chinese. And study Chinese history, for goodness sake. So I came back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I used to call her Lucy Chen. Got her scholarship to Mount Holyoke. She was still writing stories in Chinese, and at that time it was very hard for her to get published in Taiwan. She was a woman and Taiwanese, so it always strikes against her.
Yeah. She was on the left too, right?
Well, she became on the left, but she was an incredibly smart, interesting person. And Liao was he would like to be a Chinese scholar, wear his robes. But Taiwan was about to emerge into the modern commercial era, but there was still a lot of it was quite traditional. I mean, it's very hard to picture. Taiwan did not become a business success story for another 10 years. It was quite backwards at that time.
And when you say backwards, do you have an example?
There was no business investment yet. The powerful force was the nationalist government, which had its army and police. The Chinese nationalists they would have liked to be more like the communists, but they were less successful.
So after he's a Fulbright student there in Taiwan, Mr. Butterfield goes back to Harvard. He becomes a PhD student of John Fairbank's, doing research on Chinese history. And in 1967, he went back to Taiwan on a different scholarship. He gets to Taiwan and he describes the difficulty of actually getting access to the archives that he needed to do his research. For his dissertation, he was working on the political situation after Sun Yat-sen died, researching a politician who thought he was going to take over the KMT party and the state of China after Sun Yat-sen died. So Sun Yat-sen dies in 1924. This politician, Hu Hanmin, thinks that he is going to be Sun Yat-sen's successor. Hu Hanmin did not succeed Sun Yat-sen, as most of y'all probably know. The guy who did take over, and this name is much more familiar, Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek, of course, in the late 1960s, was still in charge of Taiwan. He had a beef with Mao that he didn't win, but he was able to retain control of Taiwan at the time Mr. Butterfield is trying to carry out his research. So y'all can imagine that the archivist in charge of these papers, not super cooperative.
I came back to graduate school at Harvard under the influence of my professor, John Fairbank, who said to get serious. So I came back and was trying to get my dissertation done. And I had a topic that I was researching that required me to do research in the Chinese Nationalist Archives in Taiwan. So I got a Ford Foreign Area Fellowship and I got back to Taiwan a second time, 1967. And it was while I was living there the second time and trying to do the research on my dissertation that I discovered this really wasn't for me. One problem was that the archives that I wanted to use, because I was writing about a man who thought he would succeed Sun Yat-sen as the leader of the Chinese Nationalist Party. He was a sort of traditional Chinese politician. And what he didn't understand was that you needed an army. You needed a political party and organization, and you definitely needed an army and police. And he didn't have that. He had a very traditional following of people in dark robes who were very good at scholarship. And the Chinese Nationalist Archives, they brought all these documents from the mainland, but they were kept in a vaulted archives library, but they put it out in the middle of rice paddies in a village in central Taiwan, outside of Taichung, the capital of Taiwan province. From the city of Taichung, you had to take 3 different buses to get out to this very small village where the archives were. So I tried doing that for a number of weeks and months. But I had to live in Taichung, and then I had to go out and live in this local village. And it was really daunting. When you got to the archives, they kept asking you what you wanted. And I would say, I want this or that. They said, well, they didn't have that. Actually, they did. They just didn't want to show it to me. So I had this contest of wills. I would say that I wanted this and that document, and they would say they didn't have it. So they would give me something else, which sometimes would be interesting. And after 6 months of that, I realized this dissertation was going nowhere.
Why were they so resistant? Was it they didn't want you to know?
It was the thing about secrecy.
Yeah.
Me. Everything is a secret. So it was very hard to get access to these were documents from the late 1920s and early 1930s, things that happened back in mainland China, and I wasn't supposed to see it. It was very, very frustrating.
So Fox Butterfield encounters all these problems doing academic research. Those of y'all who are in academia probably know what he's talking about, although it sounds like his experience was pretty extreme. Good news. It was during this period that Mr. Butterfield found his calling, journalism. We talked about how Mr. Butterfield got into journalism and also how Taiwan played this role in the Vietnam War that America waged in Asia. It's often forgotten that Taiwan was America's whorehouse during the Vietnam War. In my book, China's Backstory, I actually talk a bit about how Taiwan's sex industry played a role in the Vietnam War. So, of course, I was particularly interested in that topic and what Mr. Butterfield witnessed. In this next section, we're going to talk about Taiwan's role in the Vietnam War and how Mr. Butterfield, being in Taiwan at the height of the Vietnam War, positioned him to write for the New York Times.
I came back to Taiwan the second time in 1967. It was really the middle of the Vietnam War. And American soldiers were coming from Vietnam on R&R to Taiwan. And they were coming for part of the package was if you were sent off to Vietnam, you got one R&R while you were there. Most soldiers were there for a year. That was the tour was a year. And they would get this one all expenses paid tour to Taiwan, which was really a chance to sleep with Chinese girls.
I was going to ask.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
It was a prostitution R&R.
Was the U.S. government closely involved in that? Or?
No, they weren't. They didn't organize the brothels.
Okay.
No, that was not that. Okay. But they provided the airplanes to get people to Taiwan, and they paid the soldiers' way. Soldiers had to pay for that. I mean, as I remember, it was the soldiers had to save up some of their money, which they would because there was nothing to spend it on in Vietnam. So they would save this money. $100 would take a week's worth of girls. So they were coming in prodigious numbers. They also eventually had some going to Thailand, and maybe a few went to Cambodia or to Laos, but most people really wanted to come to Taiwan.
Why Taiwan?
The local businessmen figured out a way to make money, and they turned this into a profit center. It's a different time. So the U.S. government didn't organize this to encourage prostitution, but they were trying to keep the troops happy.
Sure.
And a few of the soldiers, mostly officers, had wives, and they were able to. A few of them were able to bring their wives to Taiwan from the U.S. and the military paid for that.
Okay.
So if they had wives and children, they did that. So it wasn't just for the local girls. But Taiwan was a easy spot it's a friendly spot. The government was friendly to the U.S. and it was safe, and it was a pretty short flight to Vietnam.
While you were in Taiwan, there working on your graduate studies, a reporter came through, and you got an article in the New York Times, right?
One of my friends, another American graduate student, said to me, "Fox, you spend so much time reading newspapers, you should become a journalist." I had some journalistic knowledge because my father was an American historian, but his two brothers, one older, one younger, both worked as journalists of one kind or another. My father's older brother, Roger Butterfield, his first job was he was a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer and lived in Philadelphia, and ultimately worked for the Saturday Evening Post, which was a very successful magazine, and became a star writer at Life magazine, which was a really big deal in those days. He wrote a very popular book which sold very well called The American Past. And because he was a big star at Life magazine, he was on very good terms with Henry Luce, who was the publisher of Time and Life, and a big deal in American journalism. And when I was in Taiwan, I started to get interested in journalism, I was able to come home for one visit to the United States, and I went to see my uncle in New York, and he took me to meet Henry Luce. So he encouraged me to become a journalist, while I didn't really know much about it. And the only place I could find a book on journalism was at the USIS library. You know what USIS, United States Information Service library. And they had a wonderful library in Taiwan, an English language library with books. And it was open to people in Taiwan as well as Americans. And they had one book that I found. It was an elementary textbook on how to be a journalist. So I went in and checked it out and basically memorized it. I learned what is a lead in a story, and how do you write a story, and how do you outline a story. These very basic things which I knew nothing about. I'd always been able to write because my family was full of writers, but I was never on a school newspaper. And Stanley Carnell was a star Washington Post reporter. He came to Taiwan, and I heard he was coming, so I went and looked him up. I found his hotel room, went to see him, and he said, "Would you like to be my stringer in Taiwan?" I said, "Sure." He explained to me what I did, and So I wrote a couple of stories for him. What I didn't realize was when he said he wanted me to be a stringer was that he wanted me to send him story ideas and he would come and write them. So I would send him these story ideas and he would write the stories. So that wasn't working out very well. So I was invited to attend a conference on China, but they were inviting people who were actually from the mainland, but you couldn't do it in the United States at the time because the U.S. and China did not have relations. So it was in Montreal, in Canada, and I met a very senior and distinguished correspondent from the New York Times, Harrison Salisbury, who was interested in China and he was hoping to go to China. And I explained that I was living in Taiwan and I would love to be a journalist there. And he said, well, send me some stories. So I had this bad experience with the Washington Post, so I wasn't quite sure. But he said, no, we'll figure it out. So I sent him a story, and without my realizing it, he sent it on to the New York Times. And my parents sent me a telegram a day later, because that's how you communicate. There was no phone service. And they said, Fox, what are you doing? You have a story on the front page of the New York Times that has your name on it.
And so like that, you were a journalist.
That was, so I thought I was a journalist. That was the first step. So yes, it was a story that I had heard about, that Chiang Kai-shek's son, Chiang Jingguo, who he was kind of grooming to be his successor, who had emerged in control of the secret police in Taiwan, was going to become the successor eventually when Chiang Kai-shek died. But you were not allowed to talk about Chiang Kai-shek dying because Chinese are very superstitious about death. And if you even talked about somebody succeeding somebody, that was a major crime. People would go to prison for things like that. Just Taiwanese who wrote things like that would be in big trouble. So I said that Chiang Kai-shek was in essence grooming his son, who was running one of the police agencies, to become his successor. And that was the story that ended up on the front page of the New York Times with my byline.
Did that get you in trouble while you were living in Taiwan?
Well, people asked questions about it. But I was so excited. And I thought I was a New York Times correspondent. No, not quite, but...
Sure.
But it was a sign that I could actually do something. And after about 10 or 12 of these stories, I got a cable, as we called them in those days. I got a telegram and invited me to come back and work at the New York Times.
At this point, we're going to transition to talking about Mr. Butterfield's actual career at the New York Times, how Mr. Butterfield won a Pulitzer and went on to be this incredibly successful journalist whose career, at least for a bit of time, had very little to do with China.
I thought they wanted me to be a correspondent, which wasn't really quite true. They wanted me to come back and start as a copy boy, working in the newsroom to learn the craft. So in late December of 1969, I found myself in New York, and I walked into the newsroom, and they showed me where to sit, and I started as a copy boy. But they were very nice, and they said, if I could come up with some topics and I could write some stories in my own time. So I would stick around at night and weekends and started writing stories. And after about 6 months or so of that, I got a message from the secretary to the managing editor, which was the boss at that time, E.M. Rosenthal. And she said that Mr. Rosenthal wants to see you in his office. I thought, oh no, I've done something wrong.
Just like with Fairbanks.
He said, Fox, you're doing a nice job. We've got hold of the secret story of how the United States got involved in Vietnam. Neil Sheehan has got all these papers. We've got rooms at the New York Hilton Hotel. We'd like you to go join Neil and work on this project. And that was the beginning of the Pentagon Papers.
Wow.
So I was still, wasn't on staff as a reporter, but I got invited to join. And at that time it was Neil, and they had 2 editors and a person who was a researcher at the New York Times, a young woman who was very good, and me, and we had 3 rooms in the New York Hilton.
Did Rosenthal invite you because of your experience in Asia?
Well, that's what I thought at the time, which was, I mean, in some ways right, but it was really, as I came to realize, it was because I was so junior. If I disappeared from the newsroom, nobody knew I was missing. Because they were very afraid that everybody, all the competitive newspapers, the Washington Post in particular, would be looking, and if somebody's byline disappeared for a long time, they must be working on a special project. And Neil Sheehan was a star reporter at the paper, who had been in Vietnam. And actually, I had met Neil earlier, and when I was still a graduate student at Harvard, and he had come and stayed with me once when he came up to give some talks at a group that I had organized of people who were interested in China and Vietnam to talk in the Boston area. He'd come up and stayed with me. So I'd known him when he was a young reporter, and I was still very much a graduate student. So it was thrilling to be asked to be part of the project that he was working on. And none of us knew exactly where the Pentagon Papers was going. But we did have a suite of rooms at the New York Hilton, and the file cabinets full of these papers that he had been able to photocopy. That project ultimately was 2 months. I had to just disappear from view for that period of time. And nobody missed me. I had to tell my parents that I'm working on something, I can't tell you what it is. You'll see me when you see me. But I wasn't married, and nobody missed me.
During this period, Mr. Butterfield was based in Saigon. He wrote extensively on Vietnam. And this was when he first met Kim Phuc, who was running from the napalm attack in that famous photo. Mr. Butterfield was also there on the last day in Saigon when the helicopters evacuated the U.S. Embassy.
When the Pentagon Papers were finally published in June, early July, I forgot it was 71, I got another message from Mr. Rosenthal's secretary who said he wants to see you in his office. So I went to see him in his office, and again, I really was concerned what this was. He said, "Fox, you did a nice job on the Pentagon Papers, so we're sending you to Vietnam." I wanted to go to report about China, but Vietnam was as close as I could get in those days. So I went off to Saigon.
How long were you in Saigon?
So that was August of 71. I'd been to Vietnam twice before that. I'd been in 1962 as a graduate student, and then again in 69 when I got into North Vietnam. But I was there from August of 71 until April 30th, 1975, which we just had our 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon.
Yeah.
Which I did not go to, although some of my still alive colleagues went to, friends, because I didn't see anything to celebrate about the fall of Saigon.
No, not much.
Well, the guy who was my photographer during that time, David Burnett, I got a call from him the other day, just came back. He had a good time, but it would have made me very sad.
Yeah.
Too many people that I knew whose lives were destroyed by that.
Saigon fell. Mr. Butterfield was evacuated to a U.S. naval ship, and almost immediately the New York Times sent him to Hong Kong to report on China. This is 1975. Western journalists were still, for the most part, not allowed into China. Hong Kong was where you did your reporting on China from. Let's hear more from Mr. Butterfield. I was going to ask you, so I think we were talking about Taiwan and Vietnam. How did you get to China? Because you're a reporter there in Saigon until 75.
So how did I get into China?
Yeah.
At the end of the war in Vietnam, I left on a helicopter on the last day.
Okay.
And the helicopter dropped me off on a Navy ship, the USS Blue Ridge, which is the Admiral's flagship for the 7th Fleet in the Pacific. And I was one of, obviously, a number of people who were evacuated who got dropped there. And then I eventually got transferred to a Marine amphibious transport ship, the Mobile, USS Mobile, where I was for 2 weeks. And when they allowed me to send a cable, because there was no telephone service at that time, and I sent a message back to my editors in New York. And I wrote a short story describing the evacuation, what happened the last day. And I got a message back saying that when I got off the ship and I got back to the U.S., they were sending me to Hong Kong. So my reward for escaping from Vietnam was to go to Hong Kong, which is where I wanted to go, which is where we covered China film. And it was a fascinating, wonderful, very busy time to live in Hong Kong. And I had a wonderful apartment in Repulse Bay looking at the ocean, and a great office. I was very lucky to have a Chinese assistant who came from the Canton area and was very interested in what was going on in the mainland. And he had all kinds of contacts. And he was kind of a paid assistant to the New York Times. So I would talk to him, and there were a small handful of foreigners who were not all Americans, they were of various descriptions, who were interested in the mainland. But bizarrely enough, China was so closed, you couldn't learn that much. There were very few people you could talk to.
We also briefly talked about the 2 to 3 years that Mr. Butterfield ran the New York Times bureau in China. Here are some of his observations. Was it Abe Rosenthal who invited you to open up the Beijing Bureau?
Yeah.
Did he just send you a cable? Or
No, well, that was done as the U.S. and China were normalizing relations. So we were talking about that first trip that I took, where I was able to go in with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That was a very big deal for me. It was a big deal for U.S. and China. That was the important part. And that was followed very quickly by actual establishment of diplomatic relations, and then the U.S. being able to start opening an embassy in Beijing.
How long were you there that first time when you're there?
You mean, how long was I there on that trip?
Yeah, that Senate Foreign Relations.
Probably 10 days.
10 days.
I don't remember, 10 days or 2 weeks.
So a very short period of time.
Yeah, so it seemed like a lot. Well, we went to Guangdong, we went to Shanghai, we went to Beijing. I don't remember where else we went. But we met with Deng Xiaoping, which was a big deal. Big deal.
What was Deng Xiaoping like?
He's very small. He's a tiny little man.
Yeah.
He had a very difficult accent.
Were you able to understand him at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
He had a mischievous smile, but he was a very short man. That's irrelevant. But
it is and it isn't, right? Like that does those kinds of impressions a billion times. That affects how someone leads this massive country.
He obviously had a big personality and a big brain, but he was physically just kind of irrelevant in some ways.
Yeah.
And he had a funny accent.
You went to China in 1979, and then the New York Times established a bureau there.
Well, when we were finally, yes, I was able to go because the U.S. and China had the key to getting in was for American correspondents. That wasn't just me; it was any American correspondent. Was the establishment of diplomatic relations. So the AP and UPI and Washington Post. There was a small group of us at first who went there, but I was the only one who spoke Chinese.
That's so crazy. I assume that allowed you to get a better in-depth understanding.
I was just very lucky.
Yeah.
I could go out and talk to people. Everybody else had to have an interpreter, and they were local interpreters, so they were, at that time, they were going to be government agents.
Were they working for the PSB pretty much? Yeah.
Well, the Chinese assigned me a interpreter / handler / my local policeman, who was helpful in some ways, but not helpful in other ways.
Huh.
He was there to watch me.
Yeah. Were you able to slip?
I had to, yes. I would figure out ways to get away from him, but then he would be disappointed. And it was a constant game. I don't know. It was a very different system. And initially, when I went there, the only place we could live was in the Beijing hotel, because there were very limited number of apartments for foreigners. I was there more than a full year before I could get my own place. And before I could set up, then I could bring my wife and 2 young children who were really babies.
Still in Hong Kong, right?
They'd been in Hong Kong.
You mentioned in the book that you were considered anti-Chinese, fanhua.
Oh.
Was there a particular reason for that?
Well, I can't tell you the chapter and verse now. That would be. I'm really sorry, but just anytime I would write something that they didn't like, that would be fanhua. And if I was able to penetrate something, those things are in the book.
You mentioned you dated in Taiwan, and in the book you talk about how dating foreigners is kind of a no-no, is very strict.
You mean Chinese?
Yeah, Chinese. I mean, I knew you were at that point married, but you talk about other foreigners in the or there was a lot of concern about any contact with foreigners.
Well, there was so many things. This whole notion of 国家秘密 is.
Yeah.
But everything was secret. You were not supposed to know this or that. They were just sort of things about daily life that where do you get your food? How much are people paid? Those were secrets. What's the word for something would be a secret. And if you one of the things was that I knew that the guy who was my handler was every few days had to go and report on me. And I would sometimes overhear a conversation where he was explaining what I had done. I had done this and done that, said this and said that.
He was making it up?
No, but he was reporting everything. But that's what it was about. Was the system of total control. But again, I apologize, but it's so long ago.
No worries. I'm trying to think of any other interesting things that I wanted to ask you. Do you remember, you talk in the book about the discotheque that they had?
I really don't remember much about that.
No worries. It's just such a kind of fantastic detail in the book.
Oh.
That was cool. Did you ever go skiing? You said you wanted to be the first foreigner to ski in China. Did you ski over there?
Not really. I try to remember. It was one of those things where I would hear that China had a place to ski, but I couldn't go there. I think that was one of the frustrations.
They limited foreigners from going there.
It was someplace where foreigners were not supposed to go.
But when we talked about his actual reporting in China, he would often point me to the book. If the listener wants to know more about that period, it would probably be better just to get the book. And I think that's actually a pretty good place to end the podcast. Fox Butterfield and his book, China, Alive in a Bitter Sea. It's an excellent book of reportage from a period where China is transitioning. Y'all can get copies on Amazon. I highly recommend y'all go out and take a look at this one. I'll put a link to it in the podcast page. This has been a really long podcast. I normally cut podcasts much shorter than this, but I just couldn't do that with this interview. It was such a great interview. As y'all know, if you're a regular listener, I usually try and end the podcast with a Chengyu. This podcast, the Chengyu is going to be pretty obvious. Shengyu Kuhai, that is, Alive in the Bitter Sea, the subtitle of Mr. Butterfield's book. Another way to translate that might be to be living in the sea of bitterness. As with most Chinese Chengyus, there are just about half a dozen ways you can translate them. Okay, I hope y'all have enjoyed this podcast. A little bit of a different format, but such a great interview. We got to hear the voice of someone who was there. He had his finger on the pulse. He literally met Deng Xiaoping. He was there when everything in China changed. My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.